The bustling airport terminal was alive with the energy of passengers hurriedly moving through the gates, each with their own destination, some lost in thought, others absorbed in conversations or glued to their smartphones. Among the sea of travelers, Olivia Wright stood out, though not in the way one might expect for someone of her status. Olivia, a black woman in her mid-40s, carried herself with quiet confidence as she made her way toward the boarding gate of her next flight. She was no ordinary passenger, in fact, she was the captain of the very flight she was boarding. However, today she wasn't dressed in her formal pilot's uniform. Instead, she wore simple, comfortable civilian clothes, a black leather jacket over a white blouse, paired with fitted jeans. Her curly hair was tied back neatly, and her aviator sunglasses sat perched on top of her head. Olivia was flying undercover, so to speak. This was part of an internal evaluation her airline occasionally conducted, sending senior pilots on flights as passengers to secretly assess the quality of service, crew professionalism, and overall safety procedures. She had done this several times before, and while she usually enjoyed the experience of flying incognito, today, something felt different. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion that had been building up over the past weeks, or perhaps it was the nagging feeling that her every step was being scrutinized. As Olivia passed through the busy security checkpoint, she glanced around, her sharp, trained eyes scanning the environment out of habit. Years of flying in all types of conditions, dealing with all kinds of people, had honed her instincts. She didn't enjoy the limelight, and off-duty, she preferred to blend in as much as possible. But there were always those subtle signs, occasional side glances from people who seemed to wonder how someone like her could have gotten to where she was. Olivia had long since learned to tune those moments out, focusing instead on her mission. With her boarding pass in hand, she made her way to Gate 47, where passengers were already lining up. She wasn't in a rush. Being a frequent flyer and the pilot, no less meant she knew exactly how the process worked. She approached the gate agent, a young man who barely looked up as he scanned her boarding pass. The transaction was swift, and Olivia moved toward the jet bridge that would lead her onto the plane. As she boarded, her focus was on the upcoming assessment. Today's flight was just another routine check, but Olivia took every assignment seriously. There was a lot riding on her evaluation. The airline had been under pressure after a few recent customer service complaints, and part of her job was to make sure the crew was operating efficiently, professionally, and adhering to the strictest safety protocols. Her colleagues respected her opinion, and her reports often led to changes in company policies. Once inside the plane, Olivia was immediately greeted by a friendly flight attendant who, unknowingly, was part of the evaluation. The flight attendant gave her a professional, if somewhat rehearsed, smile and directed her to her seat. Today, Olivia would be flying business class, though not out of any need for luxury. It was simply where she needed to be to properly assess the higher-tier services of the airline. As she made her way down the aisle, passengers were already beginning to settle in. Some were storing their bags in the overhead compartments, while others were securing themselves in their seats, adjusting headrests and flipping through the in-flight magazines. Olivia noticed a young family a few rows ahead, the parents struggling to keep their toddler entertained. To her left, a businessman in a crisp suit was already typing away on his laptop, completely oblivious to the boarding process happening around him. Olivia reached her seat and stowed her bag in the compartment above before sinking into the plush leather seat of business class. She exhaled deeply, grateful for the moment of quiet before takeoff. Her fingers traced the edge of the armrest as she mentally prepared for the flight ahead. For now, she was just another passenger anonymously blending into the crowd. Her true identity, that of Captain Olivia Wright, the pilot who would normally be in the cockpit of this very flight, remained unknown to the rest of the passengers. As the minutes passed, the plane filled up, and Olivia remained composed, her gaze drifting out the window to the tarmac below. She had seen this view countless times from the cockpit, where the responsibility of hundreds of lives weighed on her shoulders. But today, for a few hours at least, she would observe, reflect, and evaluate from a different vantage point. However, not everyone aboard was simply focused on their travels. Toward the back of the plane, seated in the economy section, was Officer Derek Riley. A white man in his late 40s, Riley was traveling on official business, accompanying a passenger who was under police custody. Riley had been a police officer for over 20 years, and though he had seen and dealt with countless situations, his career hadn't quite lived up to his expectations. Once full of ambition and idealism, he had slowly become jaded, particularly when it came to people who didn't fit his view of what belonged. Over time, he had developed an unspoken bias that colored his interactions with people, especially those who looked different from him. Riley was seated with his partner a few rows behind Olivia, though he hadn't yet noticed her. His eyes scanned the plane restlessly, not out of any real concern, but more from habit. He was always on edge, ready to find fault or reason for suspicion. In his mind, people had become predictable, and he felt that he could read a person's intent just by looking at them. As the flight attendants began the final preparations for takeoff, Riley's gaze eventually landed on Olivia. At first, it was nothing, just another passenger. But something about her demeanor caught his attention. She wasn't dressed in flashy clothes, nor did she behave ostentatiously, but there was an air of authority around her that unsettled him. To Riley, she seemed out of place. A black woman in business class, sitting alone and seemingly too composed. His years of ingrained biases whispered to him, telling him she didn't belong. He shifted in his seat, narrowing his eyes as he watched her for a few more moments. Olivia, of course, was completely unaware of his scrutiny. She was focused on her own mission, flipping through the airline's safety card as part of her quiet assessment. But for Riley, that moment planted a seed of suspicion that would soon grow into something more dangerous. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Riley's thoughts continued to swirl. He had no real reason to question her, but his gut, a gut often clouded by prejudice, told him otherwise. And as the flight lifted off into the air, a growing tension between him and Olivia was about to unfold, one that neither of them could foresee, but which would soon change everything. The plane had just reached its cruising altitude when the flight attendants began their service, moving up and down the aisles with carts of drinks and snacks. The low hum of conversation and the soft rumble of the engines created a sense of calm in the cabin. Most passengers were settled into their routines, some reading, others napping, a few flipping through in-flight entertainment. Olivia Wright, seated in business class, sipped her water, her mind partially on the flight and partially on her upcoming report. She noticed that the crew was doing a decent job, though there were a few areas that could be improved. As the cabin crew moved past her row, Olivia leaned back in her seat, glancing briefly at the passengers around her. It was a peaceful, typical flight. Nothing out of the ordinary. But several rows behind her, Officer Derek Riley's suspicion had continued to fester. Since boarding, he had been unable to shake the nagging feeling that something was off about the black woman seated in business class. The same quiet confidence that should have gone unnoticed in any other circumstance was now an irritant to him. It gnawed at him, refusing to let go. There was something about her that made him uncomfortable, an intangible quality that sparked a need to assert his authority. Riley wasn't assigned to this woman. He was supposed to be focused on the prisoner he was escorting, but his mind had already latched onto Olivia. His partner, seated next to him, was flipping through a magazine, completely unaware of the internal storm brewing in Riley's mind. Riley stared at Olivia from behind, unable to explain why she unsettled him so much. He didn't have anything solid to act on, no real cause for suspicion, but his instincts, or rather his prejudices, had convinced him that she didn't belong here. Not in business class, not on this flight. He could feel it in his gut. As he kept watching her, Riley's irritation grew. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that she must be hiding something. What could it be? Drugs? A false identity? Maybe she was a smuggler, or worse, involved in some elaborate scheme. His mind raced through scenarios, each more unfounded than the last, but the seed of distrust had already sprouted. It was as though he was searching for anything to justify the unease he felt. Finally, Riley leaned over to his partner, Officer Jack Thompson, who had been lost in the latest issue of a sports magazine. "See that woman up there?" Riley asked, nodding toward Olivia. Thompson barely glanced up. "What about her?" "I don't know. Something feels off about her," Riley muttered, eyes still fixed on Olivia. "I think we should check her out." Thompson sighed, shaking his head. "Derek, she's just sitting there, minding her own business. Let it go. We're here to escort the prisoner, remember? Not harass passengers." But Riley wasn't listening. His gut told him something was wrong, and he wasn't about to ignore it. He stood up from his seat, straightening his uniform as he stepped into the aisle. The passengers around him barely noticed as he began making his way toward the front of the plane. Thompson watched him for a moment, shaking his head in disbelief, but didn't follow. He had seen Riley go off on tangents like this before, and it never ended well. But this time, he decided to stay out of it. As Riley approached Olivia's row, she was completely unaware of the officer's scrutiny. She was focused on her notes, reviewing the crew's performance so far, her thoughts miles away from the situation about to unfold. Without warning, Riley stopped by her seat, looming over her with a cold, calculating expression. Olivia, sensing someone standing near her, looked up, her brow furrowed in mild confusion. She wasn't used to being approached like this when she wasn't in uniform. The look on the officer's face was not friendly, it was one of silent accusation, the kind that immediately put people on edge. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification," Riley said, his tone sharp and authoritative, as though she were already guilty of something. Olivia blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." "Your ID," Riley repeated, louder this time, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. His stance was rigid, and the intensity in his voice was unmistakable. To him, this was no longer a casual request. Olivia's confusion deepened. She'd been on countless flights and never had an officer demanded her identification like this. Still, she remained calm. Years of experience dealing with high-pressure situations had taught her to keep her composure, even when confronted with the unexpected. "Why do you need my ID?" Olivia asked, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't about to be bullied, especially when she knew she had done nothing wrong. Riley's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone he already distrusted. "It's a routine check," he lied, the words coming out clipped and impatient. "Now hand over your ID." Olivia could sense the hostility behind his words, but she didn't rise to it. She slowly reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. Her instinct told her that this was more than just a routine check, but she wasn't about to escalate the situation. She handed her ID to Riley, who snatched it from her hand with barely a glance at her. He looked at the ID for a moment, his expression unchanged. "Olivia Wright," he muttered, scanning the card for any signs of forgery. The name seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. He was still convinced there was more to this woman than met the eye. Olivia watched him carefully, noting the way he handled her ID with such disdain. She had dealt with officers like him before, men who didn't need a reason to treat her with suspicion, men who acted as though her very presence was a crime. She could feel the tension radiating from him, but she remained composed, waiting to see how this would unfold. Riley handed the ID back to her, his suspicions still gnawing at him. Something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, and the fact that he couldn't immediately prove it only made him more determined to dig deeper. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his tone laced with accusation. "Yes," Olivia replied, keeping her answers short and to the point. "What's your business on this flight?" Olivia paused, her patience wearing thin. She was tempted to reveal her identity as the pilot, to put an end to this ridiculous interrogation, but something stopped her. She wanted to see how far this officer would go, how far he would push without any real cause. Instead, she answered calmly, "I'm just a passenger, like everyone else." Riley didn't believe her. He felt the weight of the stares from the other passengers and knew that he had to make a move. This was no longer just about suspicion, it was about proving that he was right. He had to find something. "You mind if I check your bag?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. His hand was already hovering near the strap of her bag, ready to grab it. Olivia's eyes narrowed. This was crossing the line. "Yes, I do mind," she said firmly, pulling her bag closer to her. "I've given you my ID. I don't see why you need to go through my things." But Riley was already past the point of reason. His need to assert control over the situation over her had taken over. Without waiting for her permission, he reached for the bag, pulling it toward him. Olivia stood up abruptly, her calm demeanor finally giving way to frustration. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmur of the cabin. The tension between them was palpable. Riley's hand froze on the strap of her bag as he realized the scene he was creating. Passengers around them began to glance over, their curiosity piqued. For a moment, Riley hesitated, caught between his desire to press forward and the growing realization that he might have made a mistake. But it was too late. The catalyst had been set in motion, and what happened next would unravel everything. The tension in the cabin was now unmistakable. The once calm atmosphere of the plane had shifted, like a ripple in still water that slowly turns into a wave. Passengers began whispering among themselves, exchanging confused glances as they watched the confrontation between Officer Derek Riley and Olivia Wright unfold. What had started as a routine flight was quickly becoming something more volatile, something unpredictable. Olivia stood her ground, her gaze locked on Riley's hand as it hovered over her bag. The cool, professional demeanor she had maintained throughout the interrogation was cracking, but not from fear, from righteous anger. She had given him everything he asked: for her ID, her cooperation, her patience, and still, it wasn't enough. She wasn't just another passenger in his eyes, she was a target. "Step away from my bag," Olivia said, her voice low but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had spent years in command. For a moment, Riley hesitated. The passengers around them had fallen into a hushed silence, watching with growing unease. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, feel the atmosphere shifting against him, but he refused to back down. Something inside him, perhaps pride or a deep-rooted fear of being wrong, pushed him forward. He was the officer here, the one with the authority, the one with the badge. He couldn't let this woman challenge him like this. Riley squared his shoulders, his hand finally closing around the strap of Olivia's bag. "Ma'am, I need to check this for security purposes," he said, though the words came out with less certainty than before. No, you don't, Olivia shot back, taking a step closer to him. You've seen my ID. I've answered your questions. You have no reason to go through my personal belongings. The words hung in the air, thick with defiance. Riley's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he pulled the bag toward him, fully intending to open it. But Olivia was faster. In one fluid motion, she yanked the bag from his grip and held it close to her chest. I said no. The sudden movement startled Riley, causing him to stumble back slightly. For a moment, a flicker of something like shock passed through his eyes. He wasn't used to being defied so openly, especially by someone like her, someone he had already mentally labeled as guilty without any proof. Around them, the passengers were no longer just whispering. Some were openly staring, while others began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what was happening or how far it would go. The flight attendants, who had been serving drinks just moments ago, stood frozen at the front of the cabin, exchanging worried looks but unsure of how to intervene. Olivia could feel the eyes of the entire cabin on her, but she didn't care. She had been through worse situations than this. As a black woman in a position of authority, she had faced prejudice and bias countless times throughout her career, both overt and subtle. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to undermine her, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But today she wasn't going to let it slide. "Officer, you're out of line," Olivia said, her voice steady but seething with controlled anger. "I don't know what kind of authority you think you have here, but this isn't your jurisdiction. You're overstepping." Riley's face flushed with anger. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like that, least of all a black woman. His ego flared, his sense of control slipping with every word she spoke. He had to reassert his dominance, had to show her and everyone watching that he was the one in charge. "Ma'am, if you don't hand over that bag right now, I'll have you detained," Riley snapped, his voice rising. The threat was empty, but it was the only card he had left to play. "Detained? For what?" Olivia shot back, incredulous. "For refusing to let you violate my privacy." Riley's eyes flashed with anger, and he took another step toward her. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Olivia didn't back down. "No, you're the one making this harder. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. You're harassing me because you've already made up your mind about who I am, haven't you?" The words cut deep. Riley could feel the shift in the air, the mounting pressure from the passengers, from the crew, from the situation spiraling out of his control. But instead of backing down, instead of admitting his mistake, he doubled down. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Riley growled, his hand moving toward his belt where his police badge was clipped. He pulled it out, flashing it in front of her face as if it were a weapon. "I'm an officer of the law, and I have every right to search anyone I deem suspicious. You're resisting, and that's grounds for detainment." Olivia's eyes flicked to the badge for a brief moment, unimpressed. She had seen plenty of those in her time, and it didn't intimidate her. If anything, it only solidified her resolve. "You may be an officer," she said, her voice sharp, "but you're also a man who doesn't know what he's doing. You're targeting me because of what you think I am, not because of anything I've done." Riley's hand tightened around his badge, his face turning a shade redder. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The question came from a flight attendant who had finally mustered up the courage to approach the escalating scene. She was a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with blonde hair neatly tied back in a bun. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with uncertainty as she glanced between Riley and Olivia. Riley turned toward the attendant, clearly irritated by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "Go back to your duties." But the flight attendant didn't move. She stood her ground, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening, but unwilling to simply turn a blind eye. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we're about to serve the meal, and you're disrupting the other passengers. Can we please handle this calmly?" Calmly, Riley's voice rose in disbelief. "This woman is refusing to cooperate with a lawful request. If you don't want this to escalate further, I suggest you stay out of it." The flight attendant glanced at Olivia, her expression pleading for some kind of resolution. Olivia met her gaze, understanding the woman's predicament. She could feel the pressure building, the eyes of the entire cabin now glued to them. But Olivia wasn't going to back down, not now. "There's no lawful request here," Olivia said, addressing the flight attendant directly. "This officer is harassing me without cause." The flight attendant's eyes darted nervously between them, unsure of how to proceed. It was clear that she wasn't equipped to handle this kind of situation, but she also knew that it couldn't continue like this. Riley, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, reached for his radio. He didn't have jurisdiction on this plane, but that didn't stop him from acting as if he did. He pressed the button, speaking into the device. "This is Officer Riley. I need backup. I've got a non-compliant passenger on flight 732. The flight attendant's face paled further. "Sir, this is not necessary," she said, her voice strained. "We can handle this without involving." "I said I need backup," Riley barked, cutting her off. He released the button on his radio and turned back to Olivia. "You're coming with me now." Olivia's patience had finally reached its limit. She wasn't just a passenger, and she wasn't going to let this officer, fueled by his own prejudices, drag her off this flight without a fight. She straightened her posture, her eyes blazing with a fire that Riley had not yet seen. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Olivia said, her voice cold and precise. "I suggest you back off before you make the biggest mistake of your life." Riley smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." "No," Olivia replied, taking a step closer to him. "You really don't." Just as the tension seemed ready to explode, a voice crackled through the plane's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently experiencing a minor delay, but we'll be taking off shortly. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." The intercom went silent, but the announcement had the desired effect. For a moment, the tension eased. Passengers shifted in their seats, some turning their attention back to their books or screens, while others continued to watch the scene unfold with wary curiosity. But for Olivia, the announcement meant something more. It was a reminder of where she was and who she was. She wasn't just any passenger on this plane, she was the captain, the one in control. And she wasn't going to let Riley take that from her. "Officer Riley," she said, her voice steady but commanding, "I'm Captain Olivia Wright. This is my plane, and you're out of line." Riley blinked, his smirk faltering. "What did you say?" "I said I'm the captain of this plane," Olivia repeated, her voice rising with authority. "And I'm ordering you to sit down and stop disrupting this flight." For a moment, Riley stood frozen, disbelief etched across his face. He had spent the last several minutes convinced that Olivia was some kind of criminal, or at the very least, someone who didn't belong in business class. And now, she was telling him that she was the one in charge. "That's impossible," Riley muttered, shaking his head. "You're lying." But Olivia wasn't lying. She had no reason to. And now the tables had turned. For a brief moment, Silence enveloped the plane. Officer Derek Riley stood still, his brain struggling to process what Olivia Wright had just told him. She was the captain of the plane? It didn't make sense. His entire worldview, his assumptions about her, crumbled in an instant. Riley had spent the past few minutes convinced that Olivia was hiding something: drugs, fake ID, a criminal history, and now she was claiming to be the one in charge of the very flight he was on. The disbelief was evident in Riley's eyes. He blinked several times, his grip on his radio tightening, as though he could somehow regain control of the situation by holding onto something, anything. The power dynamic, which had so firmly been in his favor moments ago, was now slipping through his fingers. He wasn't just wrong, he was disastrously wrong. But Olivia wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. She could see the confusion on his face, the internal battle between his ego and the dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. She remained standing, her posture straight, her expression calm but commanding. The flight attendant, who had been hovering nearby, took a step back, clearly shocked but relieved that Olivia had taken control of the situation. Riley's partner, Officer Thompson, had finally decided to intervene, slowly making his way up the aisle. He had been watching from his seat, observing the interaction escalate, but hoping it would resolve itself. Now, however, it was clear that things had gone too far. He approached cautiously, his eyes darting between Olivia and Riley. Derek Thompson said softly, trying to diffuse the tension. "Maybe we should sit down and sort this out later. This doesn't seem right." Riley snapped his head toward his partner, his frustration and disbelief bubbling to the surface. "You believe this? She's saying she's the captain. How the hell does that even?" His voice trailed off, as if he couldn't finish the thought. Even now, with the truth staring him in the face, his mind resisted it. Thompson placed a hand on Riley's shoulder, trying to calm him down. "Look, we don't want this to get any worse. Let's just take our seats, all right? We can handle this after we land." But Riley wasn't listening. His face was flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His need to maintain control, to prove he was right, clouded his judgment. He was an officer, and he had been challenged publicly. The eyes of the passengers were on him, waiting to see how he would respond. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Show me proof," Riley demanded, his voice strained but still forceful. "If you're really the captain, prove it." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't in the habit of proving herself to people who had no right to question her in the first place. But she knew this situation wasn't just about her, it was about maintaining order on the flight. The passengers were watching, the crew was watching, and she needed to end this before it spiraled further out of control. Without a word, Olivia reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her airline credentials, the ones she had always kept with her, even when she was off duty. She held them up for Riley to see, her expression never wavering. Riley stared at the credentials, his face a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and humiliation. It was real. Her name, her title, Captain Olivia Wright, it was all right there, staring back at him. For a moment he didn't know what to do. His entire narrative had just been shattered. The passengers around them, who had been watching with growing tension, now murmured among themselves, some of them visibly stunned. It was one thing to see a confrontation between a passenger and an officer, but this was something entirely different. The black woman who had been under suspicion, who had been questioned, and nearly searched without cause, was the captain of the plane. And the officer, who had assumed the worst of her, had been thoroughly, unequivocally wrong. Thompson, seeing the credentials and realizing the gravity of the situation, finally stepped in with more force. "Derek, enough," he said firmly. "We need to stop this now." Riley's face contorted with frustration, but the fight was draining out of him. The humiliation of being wrong, of publicly challenging the authority of the captain, was sinking in. He could feel the eyes of the passengers, the whispers of disbelief. This was no longer about enforcing the law, this was about salvaging what little dignity he had left. Olivia, sensing that the situation was on the verge of diffusing, took a deep breath. She knew she had the upper hand now, but she didn't want to escalate things further. She had a flight to run, passengers to look after. Her job was to ensure their safety, and right now that meant getting this officer to back down without creating more chaos. "You're done here," Officer Riley Olivia said, her voice calm but commanding. "You will take your seat and let my crew do their job. If you have any further questions or concerns, you can address them with the airline after we land. But right now I am in charge, and you need to stand down." Riley stood there for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His pride, his authority, everything he had built his identity on, had been challenged and shattered. But there was nothing left for him to do. He had lost, and everyone knew it. Finally, with a tight jaw and a defeated look in his eyes, Riley stepped back. "Fine," he muttered through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over." He turned and walked back down the aisle, his shoulders hunched, his partner following closely behind. Thompson shot Olivia an apologetic look as he passed, clearly embarrassed by his colleague's actions. Olivia watched them go, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't over, not for Riley, and not for her. There would be repercussions for what had happened. But for now, the immediate crisis had passed. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, let out a shaky breath. "Captain Wright," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "It's all right," Olivia replied, her voice softening slightly. "You couldn't have known." The flight attendant nodded, clearly still shaken by the ordeal. "Is there anything I can do?" "Just make sure the passengers are comfortable," Olivia said, her tone returning to its usual professional calm. "We're about to start the meal service. Let's keep everything running smoothly." The flight attendant nodded and hurried away to tend to the passengers, many of whom were still talking in hushed tones about what had just transpired. Olivia remained standing for a moment, collecting herself, before finally returning to her seat. As she sat down, the weight of the situation hit her. The adrenaline that had kept her steady during the confrontation was wearing off, leaving her with a lingering sense of frustration and exhaustion. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention, this kind of fight. All she had wanted was to quietly assess the flight, do her job, and blend in. But now she was at the center of a situation that was bound to have consequences. Olivia glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by as the plane cruised smoothly through the sky. She had been through enough in her career to know that this wouldn't be the last time she'd face something like this. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and there would always be people like Riley, people who judged her before they even knew her name. But this time was different. This time it had happened in front of an entire plane of passengers. There were witnesses, people who had seen what had gone down. Olivia knew that once they landed, word would spread. And while that might bring her some measure of justice, it also meant scrutiny she hadn't asked for. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to push the thoughts away. Right now, she needed to focus on the flight, on her responsibilities. There would be time to deal with the fallout later. But even as she tried to relax, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Back in economy, Riley slumped into his seat, his mind racing. His partner sat beside him, glancing over occasionally but saying nothing. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy between them. Riley's hands shook as he rubbed them together, his mind replaying the confrontation over and over. How had he missed it? How had he let this happen? He had been so sure, so absolutely certain that something was off about that woman. But now, he was the one who looked like a fool. And the worst part, everyone had seen it. The passengers, his partner, the flight crew, they had all witnessed his failure. His authority had been challenged, and he had lost. That was something he wasn't used to. Riley glanced out the window, his jaw clenched in frustration. This wasn't over. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to make this right. He would regain control, no matter what it took. The flight had returned to a state of uneasy calm, but it was a fragile peace like the eye of a storm, quiet on the surface, but with the potential to erupt at any moment. Passengers were murmuring to one another in hushed tones, casting furtive glances back toward Officer Derek Riley and his partner, Thompson, who sat brooding in their seats in the rear of the plane. The confrontation between Riley and Captain Olivia Wright had not been forgotten, and though Olivia had managed to diffuse the situation for now, the tension remained palpable. Olivia, seated back in her business class seat, could still feel the residual anger simmering beneath her cool exterior. She knew she had handled the situation as professionally as possible, but the fact that it had escalated so far to begin with gnawed at her. She had been through similar experiences before, but this one was different. This was on her plane, where she was supposed to be in control, and the fact that Riley had not only questioned her authority but had done so in such a public, aggressive manner made it all the worse. The flight attendants were moving through the cabin, doing their best to maintain the normal flow of service, but even they couldn't fully mask their discomfort. Every now and then Olivia caught one of them glancing in her direction, their expressions tinged with concern. They respected her, they knew her reputation as a competent, even-tempered pilot, but they also knew that what had just happened wasn't something that could easily be brushed aside. In the back of the plane, Riley was stewing. His face was set in a grim scowl, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The adrenaline from the confrontation still pumped through his veins, mixing with a potent cocktail of shame and rage. He had been humiliated publicly, no less by a woman he had assumed to be a threat, only to find out she was the captain of the flight. Every instinct he had followed, every gut feeling, had betrayed him. Riley could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him. He knew they were whispering, judging him, just as they had judged Olivia moments ago. Only now the judgment was on him. The hero had become the villain in the eyes of everyone aboard, and that was something Riley's ego simply couldn't handle. "You need to let this go," Derek Thompson whispered from beside him, his voice low and cautious. He could sense the brewing storm in Riley, but he was trying to keep things from getting worse. Riley didn't respond. His jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes were fixed on the back of Olivia's seat, several rows ahead. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. He couldn't let it be. How could he just sit there and accept defeat? To back down now would mean admitting that he was wrong, that he had misread the situation, allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment. Derek Thompson pressed, his tone more urgent now. "We're still on duty. Just let it go." Riley's eyes flicked to his partner, narrowing. "You think I'm just going to sit here and pretend that didn't happen?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She made a fool of me. I don't care if she's the captain, there's something off about her, and I'm going to find out what it is." Thompson shook his head in disbelief. You're going to make things worse, man. We've got a job to do, just focus on that. This isn't about you. Riley's gaze hardened. No, he said quietly. It's about respect. And she's going to learn what happens when you disrespect an officer. Before Thompson could stop him, Riley unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, moving purposefully toward the front of the plane. Thompson grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down, but Riley shook him off with a forceful jerk. Damn it, Derek Thompson muttered under his breath, but he didn't follow. He knew this was a disaster in the making, but Riley was too far gone. There was nothing he could do to stop him now. Riley stalked up the aisle, his steps heavy with anger. He ignored the curious stares of the passengers as he made his way toward business class. In his mind, this was his last chance to salvage his pride, to regain control of the situation. He couldn't let it end like this, with him as the fool. Not in front of these people. As Riley neared Olivia's seat, she sensed his presence before she even saw him. Her instincts, honed from years of dealing with difficult situations, went on high alert. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of Riley out of the corner of her eye. His expression was one of barely contained fury, and Olivia's heart sank. She had hoped he would let it go, but clearly he wasn't finished. Olivia straightened in her seat, bracing herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. Captain Wright, Riley said, his voice laced with thinly veiled hostility. We need to have a little chat. Olivia turned to face him fully, her expression calm but firm. Officer Riley, she replied evenly, I thought we'd settled this. Riley leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You don't get to walk away from this. Not after what you pulled. Olivia's eyes narrowed. What I pulled was exercising my authority as the captain of this flight. You were the one out of line, officer. I suggest you return to your seat before this escalates further. But Riley wasn't backing down. If anything, her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel his anger. He wasn't used to being talked to like this, least of all by a black woman, least of all in front of an audience. The frustration boiled over inside him, and before he could stop himself, the words spilled out. You think you're above the rules, don't you? Just because you're a captain? Well, let me tell you something, your little power trip doesn't mean a damn thing to me. Olivia's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained composed. This isn't about a power trip, it's about following protocol. You were in the wrong, and instead of accepting that, you're making this personal. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior on my flight. Riley sneered. Oh, I'm the one making it personal. You think just because you've got a fancy title, you can talk down to me? You're nothing but. That's enough. Olivia's voice cut through his tirade like a whip, sharp and commanding. She stood up, facing him fully now. The passengers nearby fell silent, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. I don't know what your problem is, Officer Riley, Olivia continued, her voice low but firm, but I'm warning you, as the captain of this plane, you will not harass me or anyone else on board. If you continue to behave this way, I'll have you removed from the flight. Riley's face twisted in disbelief. Removed? You're going to have me removed? Olivia didn't blink. If I have to, yes. The intensity in her voice gave Riley pause. For a moment he seemed unsure of how to proceed. His ego was screaming at him to push back, to assert his dominance, but deep down he knew that Olivia held all the cards. She was the captain. She was in charge. And no matter how much he hated to admit it, she had the authority to follow through on her threat. But the fire in him hadn't fully burned out yet. You're making a big mistake, Riley said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Olivia met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." Before Riley could respond, a new voice entered the fray. "What the hell is going on here?" The voice belonged to the flight's co-pilot, a man in his late 40s named Captain Sam Taylor. He had been in the cockpit during the earlier confrontation, monitoring the situation but staying out of it, trusting Olivia to handle it. But now, as Riley's behavior escalated, Sam had been forced to intervene. Sam's presence immediately shifted the dynamic. He was a tall, imposing figure, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from decades of flying. As he approached, the tension in the cabin grew even thicker, if that were possible. Riley turned to face Sam, his expression defiant but uncertain. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "I'm the co-pilot," Sam said coolly, his eyes narrowing at Riley. "And you're out of line, officer. I suggest you sit down before this gets out of hand." Riley looked between Olivia and Sam, the reality of the situation beginning to dawn on him. He was outnumbered, outranked, and no matter how much he wanted to keep fighting, he knew that he was teetering on the edge of disaster. But still, his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "This isn't over," Riley muttered under his breath, glaring at Olivia one last time before turning on his heel and storming back down the aisle toward his seat. The tension didn't immediately dissipate. The air in the cabin remained thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Passengers were still watching, still whispering, still processing what they had witnessed. But the immediate threat had passed. Sam turned to Olivia, his expression softening. "You okay?" Olivia nodded, though her muscles were still tense from the encounter. "Yeah, thanks for stepping in." Sam gave her a small smile. "I knew you had it under control, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to back you up." Olivia smiled back, grateful for the support. "I appreciate it." Sam nodded, then glanced down the aisle where Riley had disappeared. "You want to file a report when we land?" Olivia considered it for a moment. Part of her wanted to Riley had crossed so many lines that he deserved to be held accountable. But at the same time, she knew that escalating things further could bring even more scrutiny to her and to the situation. And right now, she just wanted to finish the flight without any more drama. "We'll see how things play out," she said finally. "For now, let's just focus on getting everyone home safely." Sam nodded in agreement, then turned and headed back toward the cockpit. Olivia sat back down, exhaling deeply. The worst of the confrontation seemed to be over, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Riley wasn't done. His final words echoed in her mind, "This isn't over." Something told her he wasn't the type to let things go easily. Back in his seat, Riley was seething. His chest heaved with suppressed rage, his hands clenched into fists. He had been humiliated again, and this time in front of the entire crew, with the co-pilot himself stepping in to defend that damn captain. The woman who had embarrassed him, challenged him, and now threatened his authority. He wasn't going to let this go. "Derek, you need to calm down," Thompson said quietly, trying to keep his partner from doing anything else reckless. "Calm down," Riley hissed, his voice shaking with fury. "I'm going to make sure she regrets this. I'm not letting her get away with it." Thompson shook his head, frustrated and weary. "You've already done enough damage, man. Just leave it." But Riley wasn't listening. He was already formulating his next move. He would bide his time, wait for the right moment. And when they landed, he would make sure Olivia Wright paid for making a fool of him. As the plane flew steadily toward its destination, The second escalation had ended, but the storm was far from over. The final hour of the flight had settled into a tense, uneasy calm. Olivia Wright sat in her seat, her posture relaxed but her mind still sharp, knowing the situation with Officer Riley had only been temporarily diffused. The air around her felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Her instincts told her that Riley wasn't finished. Despite the relative quiet in the cabin, Olivia could sense the undercurrents of hostility emanating from the back of the plane, where Riley sat stewing in his anger. As the flight attendants began preparing for descent, Olivia's mind shifted back to her duties. The safety of the passengers was her top priority, and with the plane now nearing its destination, her focus was on ensuring a smooth landing. She had managed to keep the situation under control so far, but the potential for further escalation lingered like a shadow over the final stretch of the flight. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the back of the plane. Riley stood up abruptly, pushing past his partner, Thompson, and storming up the aisle. Passengers turned their heads, startled by the sudden movement, some gasping softly as they saw the look of barely contained fury on Riley's face. He was coming straight for Olivia again, his eyes blazing with determination. Derek Thompson called out, trying to stop him, but it was no use. Riley was on a mission, and nothing was going to stop him now. Olivia heard the footsteps approaching and instinctively rose from her seat, ready for the confrontation she had known was coming. She turned to face Riley as he stopped in front of her, his chest heaving with anger. "This ends now," Riley spat, his voice low and venomous. Olivia met his gaze without flinching, her eyes steady. "Yes, it does," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "We're about to land, Officer Riley. Take your seat." "I'm not taking orders from you," Riley snapped, stepping closer. "You think you can just humiliate me in front of everyone and get away with it?" Olivia's patience was wearing thin. "I'm not interested in your ego, officer. My job is to ensure the safety of everyone on this plane, including you. Now take your seat before you put the rest of these passengers at risk." But Riley wasn't listening. His face twisted with rage as he took another step toward her, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you're untouchable because you're a captain? Because you outrank me here? Well, let me tell you something. When we land, I'm going to make sure you pay for what you did. You won't be flying planes anymore, that's for sure." The threat hung in the air like a blade, sharp and menacing. Passengers were watching in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Riley and Olivia, unsure of what was about to happen next. The tension was palpable, thickening with every passing second. Olivia's expression remained calm, but inside her pulse quickened. She could see the danger in Riley's eyes. He was past the point of reason. This was no longer about professional conflict, this was personal. And Olivia knew that if she didn't act quickly, things could spiral out of control. "Officer Riley," she said, her voice steady but commanding, "you need to back down. Right now." But Riley wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his fists trembling with barely suppressed rage. Or what, he sneered. "What are you going to do, Captain? Throw me off the plane?" Olivia's gaze hardened. "I'm going to make sure this plane lands safely. That's my job. Your job is to follow instructions. So sit down or I will have you restrained." Riley let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Restrained? You're going to restrain me." He took one more step, bringing him uncomfortably close to Olivia. His breath was hot, his eyes wild with anger. "I'd like to see you try." It happened in an instant. Before Riley could react, two of the flight attendants, who had been silently observing the escalation from nearby, moved swiftly. One of them, A tall man with years of experience dealing with unruly passengers grabbed Riley by the arm, while the other flight attendant reached for his other side. "Sir, you need to sit down," the tall flight attendant said, his voice calm but firm as he pulled Riley back. Riley struggled, but the flight attendants held him tightly, guiding him away from Olivia and toward the rear of the plane. Olivia remained standing, watching as the flight attendants restrained Riley, her heart pounding but her expression composed. "You're going to regret this," Riley shouted as they dragged him back to his seat. "All of you, you're all going to regret this." Olivia took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. She had known this would happen, that Riley wouldn't let it go. But now the threat of physical violence had been neutralized, at least for the moment. As the flight attendants secured Riley in his seat, Thompson, looking defeated, stood up and moved to the back of the plane to sit next to his partner. He cast Olivia a weary glance as he passed, silently apologizing for the mess his colleague had created. Olivia watched them for a moment before finally sitting back down in her seat. The commotion had left the cabin buzzing with tension, but there was no time to dwell on it. The plane was beginning its descent, and she had a job to do. She grabbed the intercom and spoke into it with the same calm, authoritative voice she had used countless times before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are stowed. We'll be landing shortly." The passengers followed her instructions, their movements stiff and anxious after witnessing the confrontation. Olivia could feel their unease, but she remained composed, her focus now entirely on ensuring a safe landing. As the plane touched down on the runway, the tension in the cabin seemed to release, replaced by the familiar, comforting sound of the wheels rolling across the tarmac. Olivia breathed a sigh of relief as the plane slowed to a stop. She had successfully diffused the situation, but she knew that the real confrontation would come once they were on the ground. Riley had made it clear that he wasn't finished, and Olivia was prepared for whatever came next. As the plane taxied to the gate, Olivia remained in her seat, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. She knew that once they disembarked, there would be questions, possibly even formal investigations. But for now, the immediate danger had passed, and she had done her job. She had kept her passengers safe. The wheels of the plane came to a stop, and the cabin door was opened. Olivia stood up, ready to face whatever waited for her outside. The plane had finally come to a complete stop, and the soft ding of the seatbelt sign turning off signaled the end of the tense journey. The passengers began to unbuckle, rising from their seats, relieved to have made it safely. Yet there was still an air of unease in the cabin. The confrontation between Officer Riley and Captain Olivia Wright lingered in their minds. Some passengers cast curious glances toward the front of the plane where Olivia stood, calm and collected, while others kept their eyes low, wanting to escape the uncomfortable energy as quickly as possible. The flight attendants moved efficiently, guiding passengers toward the exit. Olivia, standing tall near the cockpit door, exchanged brief nods with her crew. Despite the turbulence that had unfolded between her and Riley, they had handled the situation with professionalism. She was proud of them, and thankful for their support when things could have spiraled out of control. Riley, still seated in the back of the plane, seethed in silent rage. His partner, Officer Thompson, sat beside him, his expression one of defeat. Riley had pushed too far, and now he was facing the consequences. As passengers filed past him, some gave him sidelong looks, while others deliberately avoided eye contact, clearly disturbed by the outburst they had witnessed. Riley didn't care. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts of revenge, of how he would ensure that Olivia paid for the humiliation she had caused him. But Olivia wasn't thinking about Riley anymore. Her focus was on maintaining her composure, knowing that the real fallout would begin as soon as she set foot off the plane. As the last few passengers exited, Olivia took a deep breath and turned toward the cockpit one final time, ensuring everything was in order. The flight attendants thanked her for her leadership, and she offered them a brief smile in return. "Thank you," Olivia said to her crew. "You did a great job today." They nodded in appreciation, but the gratitude was muted by the tension that still hung in the air. They knew what was coming next. The captain was about to face an even bigger challenge on the ground. With one last glance around the empty plane, Olivia exited the cabin. As she stepped into the jet bridge, she was greeted by the sight of airport security personnel waiting for her. They were flanked by two senior officers, their postures rigid, their faces unreadable. Olivia had expected this. There was no way Riley would let the confrontation end without attempting to escalate it further. "Captain Wright," one of the senior officers said, his tone formal but not hostile. "We'd like to have a word with you." Olivia nodded calmly. "Of course." She followed the officers down the jet bridge, where they led her into a private area of the airport. They had already separated Riley and Thompson, taking Riley to another room to prevent further outbursts. Olivia knew that Riley's side of the story would be told through a lens of anger and ego, but she wasn't worried. She had done everything by the book, and there were plenty of witnesses to corroborate her version of events. The officers asked Olivia to recount the incident in detail, and she did so with precision and clarity. Her words were steady, and her demeanor remained calm, despite the gravity of the situation. She explained how Riley had initially approached her without cause, how he had escalated the confrontation despite her repeated attempts to de-escalate, and how his behavior had ultimately threatened the safety of the passengers. When she finished, one of the officers, a senior woman with a stern but fair expression, nodded thoughtfully. "We've spoken to the flight attendants and several passengers. Their accounts align with yours." Olivia exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She had known she was in the right, but hearing it confirmed was a relief. The senior officer continued, "Officer Riley's actions were inappropriate, and we will be conducting an internal review. He's being temporarily suspended pending further investigation." Olivia nodded, unsurprised but grateful that action was being taken. "Thank you. My priority was ensuring the safety of my passengers, and I'd like to avoid any further disruption." The officer gave her a small, respectful nod. "You handled the situation well, Captain Wright. I'm sure this incident will be resolved appropriately." With that, the officers thanked Olivia for her cooperation and assured her that they would handle the matter from here on. As she left the meeting room, Olivia felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She had faced worse situations in her career, but this one felt particularly personal. She had been challenged not just as a pilot, but as a black woman in a position of authority, and she had stood her ground. As Olivia walked through the terminal, she noticed some of the passengers from her flight sitting at nearby gates or waiting for their baggage. Some of them looked up as she passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of respect and quiet understanding. One passenger, an older woman who had witnessed the confrontation from a few rows back, gave Olivia a nod of approval, silently acknowledging the strength and composure she had shown. Olivia offered a brief, polite smile in return but didn't stop. She was ready to move on from this, to leave the confrontation behind and focus on what really mattered: her work, her responsibilities, and her integrity. As she reached the exit of the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her co-pilot, Sam Taylor. "You okay?" Olivia smiled, typing a quick response. "All good. See you at the next flight." The terminal doors slid open, and Olivia stepped out into the cool evening air. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had weathered the storm, and while the journey had been rough, she had come out on the other side stronger. In the back of her mind, Olivia knew there would be more challenges ahead. There always were. But as she walked away from the airport, she carried with her the knowledge that she had stood tall, that she had asserted her authority in the face of prejudice, and that she had done what she always did: she had flown her passengers safely to their destination. And that, more than anything, was what truly mattered.